Hey everyone, this is Scott from certmedia.com, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to properly set up your Cloudflare account for your WordPress website. So we already showed you how to install it in the last video. This video is going to be going over the configuration. I'm going to preface one important detail about page rules. When we get to the page rules, it's going to be a bit lengthier, so I'm going to do that part at the end, because there's a lot of nuance in typically bad advice that I see thrown around that causes people a lot of issues. But to start, we're going to go ahead and just look at the overview and go on to each tab. The overview tab is just your general information. You could do a quick action to declare your site as under attack. Every user will be served a JavaScript challenge. Or you can enable development mode, which for 3 hours will bypass the Cloudflare cache. Otherwise, it's basically just generalized analytics information that you get from your analytics tab. This website in particular, I think it has a worker, or I was messing around with it. But we're now going to hop on over to the DNS settings. I made a video showing you how to set up DNSSEC already, and I recommend that you do this. Otherwise, the other settings should just be flatten CNAME at root, and you only really need to have the A records enabled, which is proxied for your root and the www. If you want a subdomain to be proxied, like I made this one up, mail, it can be proxied. And if you proxy the FTP server, there's a good chance that it won't work, and you'll have to use a direct IP address connection if you use SFTP. And I had a wildcard record just set up so that way I could have a wildcard and SSL issued. Under the SSL certificate tab, this is when you're going to start getting into some real settings. Your SSL and TLS encryption mode is one that I see a lot of confusion about. Flexible SSL is used if and only if your server does not have an SSL certificate on it. So what this means is you're on a host that doesn't provide you free SSL, or you're not paying for one. A common one is GoDaddy. You don't get a free SSL. But you can set up the flexible SSL, which will send an SSL certificate and encrypt the traffic between your user and the Cloudflare server. But the traffic between the Cloudflare server and your server will not be encrypted. To get that, you need to have an SSL installed on your server. That's where the full SSL method comes in. It can use a self-signed certificate on the server. That means it can be generated by you in 5 minutes. It has no certificate authority who issued you the SSL. It means you're not using something like Let's Encrypt to issue an SSL. There's not really any downside to doing this, but the more secure method is to use full strict. Full strict is basically the same thing as full. It is end-to-end encryption, but what it does is it checks and validates the origin certificate to make sure that it's valid. If you can and you have an SSL installed on your server from Let's Encrypt, I recommend using full strict. Or if you don't have one set up, you can use full. But if you cannot use flexible SSL if you have a certificate on your server. And you should never use the off option, because in 2020, every website should have an SSL certificate, in my opinion. It is a ranking factor, and it's important for your users' security and privacy. The Edge certificate tab has some options in here that you're going to manage. The Edge certificate is the SSL that Cloudflare issues to your domain that is living on the Cloudflare server. This just means that Cloudflare issues the SSL. This will be served to the users who connect to your website and acts as a replacement. If you have an EV SSL and you're not paying for the business plan, which allows you to upload your own SSL certificate, you will unfortunately not be able to show the extended validation tag, which is when you see like on banking websites where it'll just say the name in the address bar, and it's that little green bar with your name. It won't be present. That being said, you're just fine using a standard SSL. I wouldn't pay for it for most situations. You can order an SSL certificate, which will do a couple of things. So you get a free one, but it will use a common name and it's not dedicated to your domain. What that means is when your website is being served and the user clicks to view the certificate information, it will have a common name such as SSL and then a random string for Cloudflare. It will also list other domains that share that SSL. This isn't so much of a security concern, you might need to order an SSL if you're seeking PCI compliance, but for most situations, you're totally fine with that, with the default. One thing I recommend is always using HTTPS. This will redirect all HTTP traffic to the HTTPS form, and I totally recommend doing that. The HSTS, or HTTP Strict Transport Security, effectively allows, it mentions here, and a lot of complicated nonsense, but it effectively will prevent your website from the policy enforcement protects secure websites from downgrade attacks. In a very simple overview, basically it stops your website from being stripped of the SSL. So sometimes if somebody's trying to perform a man-in-the-middle attack, they may strip the SSL so that way the information is not connected over HTTPS, meaning it's not encrypted, and they can then steal that information. HSTS also has another benefit of HSTS preload. So when we're going to set this up for you right now, this is general warning. Effectively, here's what's going to happen. If you do not have an SSL on your server and you use HSTS and you disable Cloudflare, or you just stop using an SSL altogether, users will have a hard time accessing your website. And that's because HSTS sets a max age that says this server will have an SSL for, say, 6 months or a year. It's just some standard period. And if you remove it, then your users will not be able to access your website. It'll basically constantly redirect them to the HTTPS version, which if you don't have one, isn't going to be valid. That being said, every host pretty much provides you a free SSL certificate, and so long as you stay on Cloudflare, you'll also always have an SSL. So keep that in mind. You're going to go to the next tab. So one thing you need to do is enable it. Then you can set a max age, which is the duration that the HSTS headers are cached in the browser. They recommend 6 months or more. I say go ahead and put it at 12 months. You can then choose to apply HSTS policy to subdomains. I also recommend doing that unless you know that you have one subdomain that will not have an SSL for some reason or another. I'm just going to go ahead and enable it for my implementation. Preload, what this does is it allows the browsers to preload your HSTS configuration. Basically, browsers have a giant list of websites that it knows will have HTTPS, and it'll save it. It's just think of it as a large TXT document that the browser knows of websites that if it's in this list, it has HTTPS and it has HSTS, so we will always connect to it via HTTPS. I recommend enabling this as well. And then you have the no sniff header. This, as it mentions here, is to prevent Internet Explorer and Google Chrome from MIME sniffing away from the declared content type. You can honestly choose whether you want to enable this or not. It shouldn't really matter too much, but I'm going to go ahead and enable it for this website. Really, the only thing that you're not really going to have to worry about this too much so long as you always have an SSL. The minimum TLS version is the minimum version of the TLS transport layer security, the protocol itself that these can connect to your website. 1.0 is the default. That'll give you backwards compatibility with most of the older browsers. If you're needing PCI compliance, I do believe you need to have version 1.2 or newer as this option. But most of my traffic in the analytics shows that most of my users connect over 1.2 or 1.3. Most users are at 1.2. I would not set this to TLS 1.3, or you will have users who are just not able to connect properly. Opportunistic encryption. Since we're using HTTPS all the time, this doesn't matter too much, but let's just say you're not for your own reasons. What this does is it will tell the browser, hey, this website is served over HTTP, but it will let you know that some of your websites, such as your images and your CSS, can be served over the encrypted connections. This will allow you to gain the HTTP2 parallelization effect. Basically, instead of downloading resources in little bundles, normally it's around 8 in HTTP 1.1, it'll download them all at the same time. That is why HTTP2 was such a big deal and why everybody started hammering you need to get an SSL certificate when it came out. Because instead of downloading, let's say you had a website of 80 resources. And let's say the browser downloads them in packets of 8. So it'll download 8 at a time and then get the next ones and then get the next ones and then the next ones. In theory, that is 10 bundles of items that need to be downloaded. So the problem with that, of course, naturally, is if you have images or something and it needs to wait for that bundle to be downloaded, then it goes to the next one, and then it goes to the next one. It's constantly waiting. With HTTP 2, it can download them all simultaneously. I still recommend using the SSL certificate. Opportunistic encryption, when I was testing it, didn't honestly work very well. I don't know if it was an issue with my test, but I just didn't see any real performance gains from using it. There's not really any disadvantage to leaving it on if you have an SSL certificate because it doesn't matter. It doesn't do anything for you. But I wouldn't outright disable it in case somebody is, for some reason, overriding the behavior and forcing the browser to connect via HTTP. I'm not sure how they'd get around that, but when there is a will, there is a way. TLS 1.3, just leave this option enabled. Should always be left enabled. Automatic HTTPS rewrites, again, this should be enabled if you can. It'll just search for some resources and it'll try to rewrite them from HTTP to HTTPS. This should only work for content served from your domain. So in this case, it'll only apply to the dailyexposition.com resources, not any third-party resources that may appear. One thing I want to keep in mind as well is this is not a very good rewrite. It has to do with the way that it works. So as it mentions here, we use data from the EFFS HTTPS Everywhere, which is a browser extension, and Chrome's HSTS preload list. The problem with this naturally is if you have HSTS preload enabled, which we just did, you're typically already serving the website as HTTPS and all your resources are already being served over HTTPS. In fact, I have a video that shows you how to manually update your content to point to the HTTPS, and I'll put that in the I thing up here. But really, it's very weak, but leave it enabled. Certificate transparency monitoring. This will basically just email you if an SSL certificate gets issued for your domain from any source that Cloudflare can detect. This is more just a monitoring feature to see if somebody's trying to spoof as your website, but I don't enable it because I frankly don't need any more emails from the Cloudflare or any more emails from WordFence and so on and so forth. So I don't leave it, I don't enable it. But if you like having those kinds of information sent to you, by all means, go ahead and enable it. You could choose to disable the universal SSL. Don't do that, please. Just use the SSL. You have the origin server. So what this does is it allows Cloudflare to create and sign an SSL for your domain. Origin certificates are only valid for encryption between Cloudflare and your origin server. So as this mentions, it is effectively going to give you the HTTPS full option under the Edge certificate screen that we were just at. It's not going to be full strict. Maybe Cloudflare gives themselves a special use case, but really, this is just to give an SSL on your server to provide end-to-end encryption. If you can, use Let's Encrypt. If you're on a host, GoDaddy. It's always GoDaddy. That isn't going to give you a free SSL, and you want to have full encryption. You could sign one on here and try to install it. I don't know if they're going to let you, but it's worth a shot. You may have to even pay them, but it lasts for 15 years as the maximum duration. So you can go ahead and install that. Then there's the authenticated origin polls. You're never going to use this unless you run your own server, but you have to install a special connection, special software on your server, and it does as you expect. It basically says, hey, Cloudflare is trying to download a resource from your server. Let's just say it's an image. Cloudflare will present the certificate to your server. The server will read over it and say, oh yeah, this looks good, okay, and then it sends the information to Cloudflare. And that's really all it is. It's an extra layer of security to make sure that nobody's trying to really spoof as being Cloudflare. And it's something that you're not going to be able to set up quite easy. But there is a configuration guide if you're curious, but really for most users, you don't have to worry about it. Then there's the custom host names, only available on the enterprise plan, so we're not going to talk about it. The firewall settings. Really, all you need to do in here is, this is a nice little wall that just gives you a nice list of IP addresses that have been spamming you. What you need to do, though, is you need to come over to the settings tab and set the security level to high. It defaults to medium, but I find even in most websites, even those where their audience is originating from a country that commonly receives spam and is the source of spam, the high level of security doesn't lead to many false positives. So by all means, you can go ahead and enable this. I wouldn't set it to I'm under attack unless you're being DDoSed. And that's the only time I would set it for the entire domain. I do selectively enable I'm under attack on the WP login URL, but high is totally fine for the root. Bot fight mode, enable it. What this does is it basically says if Cloudflare detects a bot, it makes it do a bunch of complicated math and tries to get the bot to either overload itself or to where the bot has to reset or just abandon the connection. It's a pretty clever bit. It's the same principle of trying to mine like a cryptocurrency. It basically just tries to use up the bot's CPU to where it can't functionally do anything else, and it has to either abandon its current connection or reset itself altogether. It's actually quite smart to try and stop non-legitimate users from harassing your website, whether it leads to any long-term blacklisting of your website from these services and spam bots, I doubt. And it does whitelist the good services that Cloudflare does keep in its whitelist. You should never really need to modify the challenge pass length, but basically if a user gets a JavaScript CAPTCHA or challenge, this is how long they're given access to your website until they revisit. 30 minutes is honestly sufficient for most users. Most of the time users are not, if it is a false positive and they're getting the CAPTCHA, they're probably only going to be there for a article that you wrote, something where they're typically going to bounce off after they get the information you need. If you're noticing a trend though of somebody who's constantly getting the challenge pass and you run a community-based website like BBPress or BuddyPress, I would whitelist their IP address or at least work out some special rule to where they're not getting constantly flagged, because that's just not beneficial to them at that point. The last two options are on by default and I recommend them. Browser integrity check just helps to detect if a browser is, if there's HTTP headers that the browser is sending, if it determines to be a threat and it blocks them, it does stop some bad users, or bad bots rather. So I recommend leaving it enabled. Privacy Pass is a extension for Google Chrome. I could do a whole video on Privacy Pass, but it's really just a means of stopping users from receiving CAPTCHAs when they're not doing anything malicious. It's a good workaround for specific users who constantly hate being flagged, especially those who use VPNs. It's a fine service, and I wouldn't blacklist them for any reason. Cloudflare Access is a paid service. It is free until September 1st because of the ongoing events in the world. I'm not going to go over the service, but think of it as instead of your users needing to connect to your site or your server via a VPN, Cloudflare acts as the VPN. Because Cloudflare really is a reverse proxy, so it only makes sense that Cloudflare can kind of act like a proxy / a VPN for your users without them needing to install any software. It's actually really clever, but again, I'm not going to touch it on this video. The optimization settings. This is what everybody's probably here for, and I'll make sure that there is a timestamp in the comments. So if you're viewing this, congratulations, you found the timestamp. The auto minify section. Enable all three options. The primary reason for this is auto minify is very conservative. It doesn't really overwrite any code. It removes some white space, but not much, and it's really only a means of comment removal. So when you're using WP Rocket, W3 Total Cache, WP Super Cache, they add that little snippet in your HTML, for instance. It will remove that. I've never run into a situation where this has actually broken anything. Unless your website's code was janky to begin with, there's not a real reason that this would break anything because it is so conservative. So I wouldn't be concerned with enabling this option. The Brotli compression. Brotli is a newer form of gzip. It works functionally the same. You can tend to get better compression ratios using Brotli though, so I do recommend that it is enabled. It should be enabled by default, but in case it's not, go ahead and enable it. If the browser that is connecting to your server though doesn't support Brotli, it will automatically default back to gzip, so there is nothing to worry about, such as decoding errors or anything silly like that. The rocket loader. I get asked about this a lot, and it's a little complicated to explain, so I'm going to basically just give you a very simple overview. It functionally works the same as deferring your JavaScript. What it does is it rewrites your script tags. So let's see if I can find it. It adds a little script tag for the rocket loader JS, but then it also rewrites your script tags like this. So it rewrites the script type to be some random string, which is a custom nonce, basically assigned by Cloudflare, and it does -text/JavaScript. The thought process is the browser cannot recognize what that type attribute is. And if the browser cannot recognize the type attribute, it skips it. The advantage to the rocket loader over just deferring your JS is this works with inline scripts as well, which means if you have jQuery, but jQuery can't be deferred like you normally would, you can still load it in a asynchronous fashion using the Cloudflare rocket loader. The one thing I will say is the rocket loader is ignored in PageSpeed Insights. So if you run your website through PageSpeed Insights and you still get flagged for eliminate render blocking resources and it lists the JavaScript file, that is because why? If you use the Chrome Lighthouse tool though, which is in your dev tools, it will not be ignored. So these scripts will be registered as deferred. Just keep that in mind for when you're testing. It works flawlessly in most implementations. The only time I've noticed any issues was on a very old Zenforo forum, and it was running on, I think it was like version 1.5, and it had to do with the Ajax functionality, but I haven't run into a situation on a WordPress website where it's outright broken anything. One thing I will note is if you're using a slider, such as Revolution slider in your header, you need to keep in mind that because all JavaScript is being deferred, this will have an impact on your website's rendering. The slider will not render until after everything else is drawn. So the content, let's say, let's go to the homepage for instance. Let's imagine that this section here was a Revolution slider and it was just one big image or two images and laid across the top. The content that's under here is not loaded via JavaScript. It is just simple HTML and CSS. So the problem is because the Rev slider is going to be deferred, it's going to load after the rest of the website. And it's a give and a take. You could try and manually exclude files from being lazy loaded from the rocket loader, but the problem with that is you're going to suffer in performance again, because the whole point of deferring JS is that the rest of the page renders a lot faster and gives a much better user experience, especially on mobile devices. But if you exclude a bulky JS collection such as Revolution slider, that benefit goes out the window. So just keep it in mind. If you can live with it though, the paint times are significantly better. I've seen websites, their paint times will drop by almost 2 to 3 times, as that'll be 2 to 3 times as fast with it enabled, because those bulky sliders aren't preventing the rest of the page from rendering. So that's just something to keep in mind. Railgun, you're not going to have Railgun unless you're on a host that provides it. For some reason, my Cloudways instance seems to have it. I've seen some Cloudways sites though not have it, so I don't know, maybe I just won. But effectively what this does is it sets up a WAN connection, and it's meant to help accelerate the delivery of the HTML document itself. And it's supposed to help when you have content that gets updated very frequently. So if you have a BuddyPress website, for instance, where you can't typically cache the HTML, this can help accelerate the delivery of that. Two things though, you need to have the business plan if it's not provided by your host, which costs $200 a month, and you need to set up software on your server. Now some hosts like Siteground bundle it. One thing I'll keep in mind though is if you're using Siteground, honestly, I tend to get worse performance with it on Siteground. And I think the reason for that is because it gets overworked on their system. And oftentimes it makes your HTML, the TTFB, increase substantially. So if you're going to use this, test in GTmatrix and then check the HTML, the very first item that gets downloaded, and see how long it takes. Run it a couple times, 3 or 4 times, with it on and with it off, and compare. See if it's loading any slower, and if it is, I would disable it. But on implementations where I've used this and set it up for sites that are on their own server, it does help quite a bit. But again, that's the difference between sharing resources with a bunch of sites and then only using it on your own. Under the mobile section, AMP real URL, you should enable this. Briefly, if you've ever gone to an AMP website on your phone and you notice the URL on your address bar is google.com/amp/thedailyexposition.com, then the article URL and so on and so forth, this will just set it so that way that URL is your actual website URL instead of the Google AMP URL. I recommend that this is enabled. I don't think I'm going to use AMP on the Daily Exposition, but if I was, I would enable this. The mobile redirect, if for some reason you have a mobile website, you could select the subdomain and then enable the redirect from here. It's much faster than doing it on the server, but don't have mobile specific sites. It's 2020. The caching level, I set it to standard. This is what you should leave it as. I wouldn't use anything else. No query string is the worst option. Effectively, any asset, your CSS, your JS, that comes with that little query string by default in WordPress will not be served from the Cloudflare CDN if the first option is checked. Ignore query string is almost as bad. What this does is it ignores the query string and caches it. So if you have a jQuery-migrate.js, and let's say you update WordPress, and WordPress updates its version of jQuery migrate and appends the new query string, it will still serve the old version until the cache is purged on Cloudflare. Standard will create a new cache for each of the version files. That's typically what I recommend. And the reason for that is most of the time users are trying to bundle their assets anyways using auto-optimize. But where you have the most issues with ignoring the query string is in your WordPress admin panel. I've seen this time and time again where somebody updates for Yoast SEO and Yoast SEO changes their JavaScript and then it breaks because they have Cloudflare enabled and they have the ignore query string option checked and they're not able to use their editor anymore. And you just have to go in, you have to purge the cache, and you have to set it to standard so that doesn't happen again. So just use it as standard. The browser cache TTL, you have two options here. You can set it to a year, which is great if your website doesn't support headers. So if your own server or your host doesn't support mod expires, you could set the expires headers here and it will functionally be the same. It'll allow your images, your CSS, your HTML. No, sorry, not your HTML, and your JS to be cached for a year. Or you could select respect existing headers, which does just that. It'll respect whatever headers your server sends to Cloudflare, and it makes sure that your users continue to get those headers. Whichever option you use, though, is totally fine. Even if you are serving your own headers from the server and you set it to a year, it'll functionally be the same. This will not cache your HTML. I'm not going to talk about this CSAM scanning tool. There's documentation on that, but it has nothing to do for most WordPress websites. The Always Online tool will cache the HTML and serve it in the event of your website going down. Now, here is my issue with this tool. It honestly doesn't work very well. Especially if you're having intermittent issues. Let's say you're working on your website and you, for some reason, edited your theme code and now you have a 500 internal server error. Most of the time, this tool just does not work. It only seems to work on websites that get a substantial amount of traffic. But hey, you can leave it enabled. Maybe it'll work for you, but most of the time, it honestly just doesn't work. And development mode was on the home screen. You enable it, you'll bypass the Cloudflare optimization settings for 2 to 3 hours, and then it disables. We're not going to touch workers because it's a fairly complicated topic, and there's a lot of in-depth nuance and scripts that can be added, but we're now going to go to the page rules since we're here and I changed my mind from earlier. The page rules section is one of those sections where people tend to make a lot of mistakes and they don't understand why. So if you've read any article, and I'm not going to mention any of those authors who give this advice, where you can cache your HTML, there are some advantages to caching your HTML, and it can be done fairly easily. What you do is you create a page rule just like this. You do star your domain, a backslash, and then another star. So anything on the dailyexposition.com. And then you can set a page rule such as this. If you are going to do this, I just say do something like this. Now what happens is your HTML will be cached on the edge for a month at a maximum. The edge cache TTL is a maximum. It is not a guarantee that the item will remain in cache that long, and it will cache everything, including the HTML. The problem with this is most sites tend to not have an auto purge functionality set up. So if you're using a caching plugin, it needs to have some way to purge the Cloudflare cache. WP Rocket has it, Swift Performance has it, a couple of others, but they're very far and few between. And this will set up auto purging. You can use the Cloudflare plugin to auto purge the Cloudflare cache. It's built in, but that plugin needs a lot of love, and they don't provide it a lot of love. It needs a rewrite, in my opinion. The interface is just clunky, and it hasn't been updated in months since the last time I've used it. I'll go over it in a future video, but for now, we're just going to ignore that. There's some things you need to learn. If you're using this functionality, though, and you are on a WooCommerce website, don't use this option, ever. If you're on a membership website, do not use this option. Effectively, if you have any dynamic bits, so any stores, if you're selling anything, if you're a bbPress website, if you're a BuddyPress website, if you're a membership website, because without the business plan, you cannot exclude this rule based on the cookies that are served from your server. So that means if you have cache everything enabled and you're selling products on your store, and a user goes and he's like, ooh, I'm going to add this to my cart. The cart will not update. That is the sad fact of it. And you can exclude the cart page and you can exclude the checkout page, but that won't matter really because you're not, the cookies are not going to be delivered to the user. And if you're using BuddyPress and bbPress, it has no way of distinguishing between when you're logged in or logged out. Now, to circumvent this, we can use a second rule to where you can exclude WP dash. This will exclude your WP login, your WP admin, anything in your WP content folder. And you can set it to standard. This is the most conservative rule that you can add to just widely ignore anything with WP. You can make 3 rules where you exclude WP-admin explicitly and WP-login.php explicitly, but this is just a cleaner way to do it. The problem is, again, while you'll be logged in, if you go to your home page when you're logged in, you won't have the admin bar and you will not be able to view your website while logged in. It'll always treat you when you're logged out. There is a way to circumvent this using Cloudflare workers. The problem is that's when you start to get a bit into the weeds and it's not as performant. So basically the rule of thumb is you shouldn't use this page rule if you're a WordPress website with any dynamic bits. And if you're a blog or a news site, just make sure you set up auto purge using some kind of plugin and you will be fine. Now, I do have one rule that you can use on your WordPress website. So unlike the other rule, we can set up kind of along the same lines, but we can go to WP-content and we could just do WP content, or you can explicitly do the uploads folder. You can do cache level and set it to cache everything. And then you can do an edge cache TTL of a month. And if for some reason your expires headers on your server are not good, you could even set a year-long browser cache TTL. This will allow you to cache your images, your videos, your PDFs, your zip files, whatever is in your uploads folder, and allow it to be cached with a Cloudflare CDN. That allows you to reduce the amount of assets that your server is having to deliver without you caching your HTML to cause a much of headache. I actually use this on quite a few websites, especially larger websites that deliver a lot of assets, and it works beautifully. So I would use this option. Network settings, just come in here and set up the options as I have followed. HTTP2 should be enabled. HTTP3 should be enabled because it's getting right around the corner. 0 RTT connection resumption should be enabled, which will help improve the speed of users who are revisiting your website by automatically setting up that TLS connection. The web sockets should be enabled. Onion routing should be enabled. Sudo IPv4 should be set to off. You shouldn't need IPv4 unless you have one really strange edge case. IP geolocation should be enabled. The maximum upload size, you can set it to 100 by default, and if you want more, you have to pay. This shouldn't stop you from uploading images though and whatnot to your website. Traffic, everything in here is a pro tool for Argo. So Argo is just a smart routing system. It allows the Cloudflare server to better route users to faster points of interest. So let's say your user is in Vancouver, and for some reason the Cloudflare server in Vancouver is down, or there's another server that's less congested in, I don't know a lot of places in Canada, I will admit. Let's say there's one in Ottawa for some reason. That's the first thing that came to my mind. All right, so let's say there's a server in Ottawa, and it's now faster than the one that's in Vancouver for some reason. Let's say that one point of interest in Vancouver is just being hammered, and it would be faster for them to go the other way. Argo will be the technology that allows them to access that to get a faster experience overall, but it's a paid service. Stream is basically a video hosting option. You upload your videos, Cloudflare will do the encoding, the delivery, and basic optimization, and you pay based on the usage. It can be quite expensive. Video streaming is expensive in general. So if you just want to serve it from the edge, that Cloudflare page rule we set up earlier will get the job done. It just will not be nearly as efficient as using Stream. The custom pages is all pro and enterprise level features. The apps section, you should probably never use Cloudflare apps unless you really want something in here for some weird reason. You're honestly just better off most of the time though implementing the features on your website via your own coding platform or whatever you're using. The only thing in here that was kind of cool was, well, you can refresh your page automatically for some reason if you wanted to, but you can integrate the Facebook Messenger, Contact Us, and some other stuff in here. But I personally don't use these apps. I just use services that I can connect via my admin panel at WordPress. The scrape shield, you can server-side excludes will hide content from disreputable users, so that way they can't scrape it. Email obfuscation will just rewrite your emails. So if you have scott.hartley@certmedia.com in your footer, it will rewrite it so that way it can't be scraped, and it will load it via JavaScript. That way you're not getting spam with emails from scrapers and bots who are out there. And then finally, the hot link protection. You could choose whether you enable this or not, but it will prevent users from copying your image URLs and serving it from their own web pages. It won't stop them from downloading them from your website, but it will save you the bandwidth of somebody who just offsite links to them. And that's really everything in Cloudflare. And that was just the free version. There's a lot more stuff in the pro version. We'll make another video on that though, but this should get you well off and on a good leg with your WordPress website. If you have any questions, as always, you can ask in the comments below. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.